Bonjour, bienvenue à...
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We are thrilled to welcome you here in this beautiful city of Nantes for the Nantes Innovation Forum. The Le Monde newspaper is organizing 3 round tables today here in Nantes about social innovation, civic innovation. You can interact with our guests. You can ask questions. We will indeed have 20 minutes of Q&A after the 40 minutes of discussion. So to ask a question and to watch the conference, please go to nantesinnovationforum.fr or on the Le Monde Événement Facebook page. After our first conference today called Understanding the Crises, for the second round of conference, we would like to take a look at how we can manage crises. And during the third roundtable, we will talk about how we can anticipate on crises. Regardless of its nature, all crises upend decision-making processes and public policies. So these exceptional circumstances and crises bring about new systems of distributions and of production, and also it breeds desire for novelty in public policy with a stronger focus on participatory policies. So how can we bring a concrete answer to this desire for more civic participation, more involvement from the people? We are going to talk about just that. We're going to take a look at the local, national, and European levels, the initiatives that are emerging during these times of crisis. We have with us 4 guests. First of all, Johanna Rolland, good afternoon. You are, well, you need no introduction, but you are the mayor of Nantes. You are also the president of Nantes Métropole and also the chairwoman of France Urbaine, the organization of large French cities. Matthieu Auzanneau, you are a former reporter with Le Monde, actually. You are currently running the Shift project. It's a think tank addressing the mitigation of climate change and studying also how we can reduce our dependence to fossil fuel as a society. And in 2015, you published an authoritative book about the history of oil, which came after several years of research on the subject. With us, we will have via video link Romain Slitine. He is going to be with us from Argentina. Good afternoon, sir. So you live in Argentina part of the year when you're not in France. You specialize in economic, social, and political transformation and transitions. You are a lecturer at Sciences Po, Sciences Politiques, and you wrote Le coup d'état citoyen, or a civic coup, which you published back in 2016. And in a moment, we will have with us Olivia Grégoire as well. Oh, you're here with us. You are speaking to us from Paris. We're very happy that you can be with us. You are a junior minister in charge of the social and inclusive economy under the responsibility of the economy minister. You used to be the spokesperson for the La République En Marche political party. You also chaired the specific parliamentary committee in charge of reviewing the Pact bill to reform the French economy. And you were also an entrepreneur before being an elected representative and a political figure. We should have had with us Robert Steen, but he is otherwise engaged in a post-COVID crisis management group. So, Romain, Slitine, putting on your Sciences Po hat, your political scientist hat, can you tell us if political crises trigger inevitably a desire for change amongst the population? Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, talked about the society of risks. He said that the risks that we face tomorrow threaten the very reproduction of life as we know it, typically with the COVID crisis. And it's so complex that elected representatives alone or public authorities alone cannot face such a high level of complexity. And so they must rely on the force of civic initiatives. Olivia Grégoire will tell us more, obviously, but this require obviously a boost to social and inclusive economy, but also a boost to democratic innovations, I would say. And by that, I mean all the initiatives coming from either individuals or elected representatives who aim at, all aimed at updating our democratic software, I would say, or a system of functioning. So this is what we've been seeing really on the rise over the last few years, a flurry of democratic innovations who are, the work of activists, NGO activists, national NGOs, or we also have, for instance, a global forum for democracy, which is held every year in Strasbourg, but it can also obviously be the work of elected representatives. And Johanna Rolland is a prime example of that. And the idea is to really rely on citizens to forge a new manner of designing public policies. Also, as an introduction, we could say that, well, we talk a lot about the role of new technologies and the internet, and we talk about civic tech, basically technological initiatives which use the internet and other technologies to shore up democracy in various countries. But let us insist on the fact that it's not all about the digital technologies, and the new forms of democracies that come about must rely on the human side of things, namely the deliberative processes. Thank you, Romain. Could you give us a definition of the words civic initiative or people initiative? Well, broadly defined, it's all the new practices. I'm not talking about new ideas. We're talking about practices. The key word is really the implementation of ideas. You want to have an actual impact in the actual world. Its aim is to give power back to people, to citizens. We're talking about a sharing agreement, so to speak. It's a power sharing agreement, basically. It's not just about asking people what they want. It's actually giving power back to the people, so that progressively we could reach what Dominique Rousseau, the constitutional expert, calls public democracy. Basically, as a citizen, as an individual, private individual, you should have the right to have your say in between elections, basically. It's not because you cast a ballot that, that you have your voice heard. You need to keep being able to be heard and to contribute to the decision-making processes. Thank you. So again, if you want to ask questions and interact with us, do go to the Nantes Innovation Forum website or the Le Monde Facebook page. We will have, again, a time of Q&A session later on. Johanna, Rolland, we've just heard Romain Slitine. What do you think about his analysis? So I agree, and we've seen this for a fact here, and this is something that we absolutely need. The question, therefore, is what for? What do we want to do with it? The challenge, and it's a noble challenge, is, years after years, ballots after ballots, we see an inevitable rise in abstention. So you can just regret it and do nothing about it, or you can decide to react. And in France, power is thought of as something very central and centralized. And so I think we should go against that. And local communities, local territories, as we call them, be they urban or rural territories, they are a lens of innovation, So it's a political decision. It requires political innovation. The second challenge would be that we live in a very polarized, fragmented society. So how do you create deliberation in such a fragmented society? So when you want to do an actual consultation, and it's not just, sticking a couple of Post-its on the wall during a meeting with, 5 people. Post-its are fine, but the more you want, you are ambitious, the more you have to be rigorous so that it's not taken as just lip service to deliberations. And you want to make sure that such a process actual impacts in the real world. That's the ultimate purpose. This is what's been driving us. 3 years ago, we organized a major consultation process on the energy transition. I know that my neighbor here is really involved in these topics, and I can testify to the sheer power and the sheer groundswell, if you will, that occurred on that occasion. And I will just give one last example from here, from Nantes. We believe that during the very difficult current health crisis, which is far from being over, and I think current events only show us that, really prove that, we must, when thinking ahead, we must listen to the experts, but also we need to give the floor to local inhabitants. So we will have a public consultation, a public convention, as we call it, a civic convention, as we call it, to this topic. Madam Junior Minister, since you joined the government in July, you consulted a lot with the stakeholders and players in the field of social and inclusion economy. Is your observation that France is lagging behind, or is doing well in terms of social and inclusion economy? Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to congratulate Mrs. Rolland for what is being done in Nantes. I haven't had the pleasure to meet her in person, but I'm looking forward to it. I don't think France is lagging behind, as you asked, but I believe that France is trying to move forward, and I really agree with what Johanna Rolland said about just paying lip service to the deliberative process. As a rule, I am usually very, straightforward and honest, and so let me, tell you right away that we try. I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying that we cannot do better. But for instance, when we take a look at how the French Economic and Social and Environmental Council was reformed to include people who have been chosen randomly, for instance, the fact that we have created so-called civic petition processes, it might not be enough, but it is important. So this was a transformation of a major institution, the Economic and Social Council, into something more democratic and more civic, I would say, and more open. Another example, the Civic Convention for Climate. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying that the government is acing it, but I'm a bit more than 40, And I had been waiting for 10 to 15 years, such a set of proposals coming from people, citizens, that could challenge current policies. So that's not necessarily very modern, but that's certainly something that we hadn't done so far. And so, again, that's nothing revolutionary, but we hadn't done it up to now. So, because as Rolland rightly said, we are seeing a dwindling participation in the electoral process. And elected representatives have a role to play. They have to react. So, for instance, Matthieu, Paula Fortezan, they are French MPs with whom we've been working since the beginning of my tenure on how in Parliament we could give the floor to private individuals during certain times in Parliament. So the idea being to give a say to the man on the street, to have a say during parliamentary debates. So not all of our projects came through, but at this point, I think two things are paramount, and maybe this could pave the way for other discussions. But first of all, I think the worst that we can do as an elected representative is to encourage false deliberation, false participatory processes, whatever name you want to give it. I think it is the worst thing. It's very counterproductive at the very least. It really drives people away. It turns people off when people understand that they've been basically used as a pretext and that everything had been decided beforehand. It's very insulting. And as Johanna Rolland said, the method is essential, because if you want to create a true deliberation process, you have to be aware of what is at stake, and the damage will be much worse to do it badly rather than not do it at all. So over the last few years, I was an MP, and there was a great moment in my career, but I don't think there should be a direct competition, if you will, between participatory democracy and representative democracy. I think Parliament is a representative body, but I also think that we should do more, we should do better on the participatory deliberative front. And if I may ask you a question, the French historian Pierre Rosanvallon talked about deliberative democracy in a book a few months ago, and he said that the best way to do that is to report more frequently and better to people what we do with our public policies. They have to be aware of what we do. They have to be informed. And so we have to make sure that that happens. So at the local level and national level, but we must be able to show something for it to voters. And I think we need to do it quite quickly. I will conclude on that for now, because I think French democracy is not very open and not very participatory. But rather than lofty speeches, I think people, especially in the younger generations, want facts and figures to explain what policies do at the local and national levels. Local governments sometimes do that better than the national level. They manage to explain what they do and explain what their policies are about. I think it will be a great source of confidence in public figures. Yes, Madam Junior Minister, you're right when you say that there needs to be also a harmonization of the sort of impact assessment methods to understand if policies are efficient. So Matthieu Auzanneau, the Shift project that you are heading specializes in just this topic. So what's your reaction? Well, we are in a crisis, obviously, and up until now, it's interesting because we've talked about the toolbox, basically the democratic tools that we can wield in such a crisis. But we basically have not talked about the crisis itself. So obviously, I'm not going to talk about COVID because I'm not a scientist, but the big crisis that mankind is going to have to face is climate warming, global warming. So, and the constraints that we'll have to take into account and that are linked to the the fact that Earth is finite, the limitations of our environment. So over the last 2 years in France, I mean, looking around, I don't think we were quite late. We can be, proud of what we've done so far, but I think there's a large consensus on the diagnosis. We are convinced in France, and it's really not the case everywhere in the world, that there is a problem with our climate. However, the therapy, I would say, is only just starting. We've talked about what tools we can use to have an actual discussion involving everyone, but I would like now to talk about how we will go about doing anything about it. So with the so-called climate convention that was mentioned previously, people were chosen randomly to, the man on the street, basically, to think about climate measures. And we realized that we took part in that conference, in that convention, and we realized and then we saw for ourselves that people, private individuals, were able to think about this and were willing to think about this. So unlike elected representatives, I wouldn't say that elected representatives are hypocrites or ignorance. Even though some elected representatives are already starting to renege on their promises regarding the climate convention. But anyway, the thing is, elected representatives tend to debate internally before turning to the actual facts, the physical facts. And now it's starting to change because in an ideological debate, and are you for or against gay marriage, for instance? But now we're talking about the vital infrastructure of our nation, and there are things that are true and things that are not true. So in the Shift project, we've been trying to quantify what we would need to do to improve public transportation, for instance, and we saw that the proposals stemming from the conference on climate, the convention, on climate, is heading into the right direction, and in heading into a better direction than the measures adopted by the government. So it's quite new because we are the country of Descartes, we're a Cartesian country. And we're talking about things that are objective, there are facts and figures. And again, the man on the street seems to be a lot more ambitious and a lot more willing to go ahead with these evidence-based proposals. So you've all given examples of everyday initiatives, and one question remains then is the scaling up of these proposals, these initiatives. Can they be scaled up? And how can we bring that about? Romain, Slitine, what's your analysis? How can we scale things up? Well, to do that, as you said, I think we have to do away with so-called laboratory democracy. where you do small-scale experiments and you're happy with it, but it doesn't really have any impact on the real world. So that's, I would call it ambition, basically. Second thing, to scale things up, you have to do things that are very practical. These democratic initiatives have to be better recognized, better supported, including politically. So I welcome the fact that Olivia Grégoire and Johanna Rolland support these questions. Politically speaking, too few elected representatives do that, I believe. And I'm talking about financial support as well. Many initiatives are underfinanced, and that's the problem with the so-called social and inclusive economy. But we need to take an interest in these democratic innovations and which are underfunded. The Ministry for Social and Inclusive Economy should also focus on funding these projects, these innovative projects that a certain number of people are trying to get off the ground. So, but most of all, to scale things up, as Olivia Grégoire just said, we shouldn't oppose deliberative democracy and representative democracy. The point is really to see how they can be intertwined. And the best example of that is the Civic Convention for Climate. I wouldn't say it's a government-led initiative, as was said, as it was presented. It is a civic initiative. I was actually a part of the group of people who raised this question at the level of the government. Me and along 100 other people, we signed a manifesto right after the Yellow Vest crisis. The idea being, how can we break the gridlock? And how can we combine the end of the month and the end of the world, as the saying went? So how can we do that in the current democratic framework?
It's about citizen participation, organization, innovation. Look at what happened with the Yellow Vests, elected officials, people from the economic field, all had their say in order to suggest the implementation of this Citizen Convention for Climate. It's a real civic movement which was understood by the president, and it gave a certain amount of strength to the position of the citizens who had obviously participated in the drawing up of this convention. They want to help support this major change in France because it's a major innovation in France, a democratic invasion. You know, if I compare it to Argentina, you know, I can tell you they're basically surveying everything that's happening in France to see what they can glean from it. So this democratic innovation really was the linchpin between citizen pressure and for a real will for democratization and an awakening of the institutions. And I think this is very powerful because from the beginning, the public wanted to give a message to the parliament. They want to talk about decrees and referendums. They wanted to talk about all of the proposals which emanated from this citizen convention. That which was done overall, as you said, Matthieu, well, there were a set number of proposals which were buried. But, you know, we have to look at things objectively and say the bottle is half full rather than half empty, because there's been a certain amount of movement thanks to this democratic movement. And that's how we can scale up. Thank you, Romain. We'll come back to that convention in a third part of today's proceedings. Olivia Grégoire, when you talk about scaling up, is this something that's important to you, something that speaks to you? How are you going to manage this? How are you going to be able to scale up in terms of the multiple practices and initiatives which are in place in France? Well, to continue in the same line of thought, in terms of frankness, you know, I came to politics 3 years ago. I'm not a professional politician. I'm becoming one. I was in an economic world working for a small company. But I think what's important today, as I see it, is, you know, to look at how we move forward. You have to say, the further I move forward, the more I really couldn't care less where the good ideas come from. The important aspect is actually have the good ideas. Now, when you look at the ideas or the proposals, it doesn't really matter where they came from. What matters is that we have 150 ideas that are going to be discussed and debated. And so I think there are a great many good ideas that come from all different places. And many of this has been born of the crisis, and I think this is very positive. There has an impact, and the impact is that there are measures that have been taken which support civic proposals. But can you be a little more concrete in your response? Well, yes, the President was very clear on this subject. 146 measures, I believe, out of the 150 that were suggested. So that's almost 100% acceptance. They're going to be discussed at legal level, and they'll probably become law within the Parliament. This will be adopted within the Parliament, or at least debated in order to become law in the upcoming months. Nearly all of the proposals have been accepted. All of the measures have been accepted. Now, you said it yourself. Yes, but beyond the convention, which of course is going to be discussed later on today, what real measures are you going to put in place to try and move things forward? Well, the democracy coming from a lab, you're right. We have to find a new method for the state innovation. We need to scale up. We need to move forward. We have to look at the financial aspects as well. I have tried to stimulate the impact contracts. We had the green bonds. What are these green bonds? What are you explaining to us, madam? It's very simple. It was very... People say that the state's actually too big to address a certain amount of problems. So you have stakeholders out there in the field who perhaps too small to be financed. What they have to do is they would like to suggest their proposal, they'd like it to be scaled up, but they don't have the financing. So the idea is that the state then is going to look at the projects which might come from associations or might come from, any organization or companies. And the idea is that the state then comes with these people who are spearheading the project and with investments, get together around the table with the project leaders, set an objective which has a social and environmental and inclusive impact. We give ourselves a year. We're going to finance it. We're going to work with an investor so that we can obtain the performance necessary. That can be performance in professional insertion for an association where they have a particular method in order to improve professional insertion in a set number of people in society. So the project leader is going to say, well, I will commit to this approach and with this approach to include roughly 100 people into my company where we can see that the performance announced, and this by social and environmental performance, is obtained. So the state will cover all of the financing and they will monitor the result of the social, environmental, inclusive impact of this act. So it means you will resolve upstream the problems which are not dealt with and where the state is too big a body. We're bringing them down to a smaller level, and where the other players are too small, we're bringing them up. So this allows us to scale up many projects. We are launching 3 different impact contracts. There's 10 million euro involved in these. The first was launched last week. You'll find it on the ADEME site for the circular economy. We're looking at the company who had a wonderful idea, which is capable of saying, well, I think we could obtain this, such and such, as a result. We'll sign the contract together. If the performance is up to par, the state is going to finance it entirely. I would just finish by saying that we have ambition. I have ambition on these impact contracts if we're putting 10 million aside dedicated to them, it's not money we have to find. Money's already in place for these projects. It's available. We'll come back to that. I think she's trying to finish. No, hold on. I have to present innovation, which is extremely complex, in less than 45 seconds. I'm sorry. I know it's very difficult. I know. We're looking for projects which are value are rated than above $1 million, €1 million. There you are. Thank you. Indeed, it's very complicated, and it's a very important question. What about these impact-based contracts? Does this seem like a solution for you, given your perspective? Yes, I think it could be one of the many tools we can use. We always have to talk about the finality. What's the end goal? Because the tool always has to serve a purpose. When you're a political manager, you have to serve society. You have to serve your inhabitants, your citizens. You have to embody these projects. We in Nantes, we have decided to make sure that the ecological transition was really there to help fight against inequality. If you want to live up to the standards set by the Paris agreements, and this is true for Nantes and anywhere else, then we have to change our software and change the way we work with the peri-urban network. If we look that all of our greenhouse gases are diminished, well, we're not going to be able to do that. So what do we do? At least to fight some of them. We work in terms of reciprocity between the rural areas and the urban areas, because our goal is the same. We want to make sure that the ecological transitions we're made to feel responsible for them. Secondly, the other scale we're talking about is the European scale. Often, there's not enough association upstream of the city and the metropolis contained within the European policies. So sometimes things happen very well, but we don't manage to get them trickled down to the area where we need these policies. And they would tell us, yes, we thought about regionalization, we thought about your cities. But even when you think about it, even if it's a deconcentration, it's not decentralization, apparently. But at the level of a region, obviously, this becomes extremely important. It's an important objective. Secondly, we have to talk about permanent interaction between the cities, the regions, national and European level. And finally, we've talked a great deal about the climate convention. This already existed at territorial level, but it didn't really exist at national level in France. For those, we are really convinced by what we're talking, and we've been looking at this with a great deal of benevolence and a great deal of attention. But I would like to look at the end of the story. Where are we going? I heard about this first-class behavior. I'm going to wait and see. But if it were true that the climate convention edited by the citizens, if it's demonetized, it's not simply this experience that's going to be rendered incredible, but it's all associative work, all political work. Every entrepreneur who tries to put this kind of policy in place, they will pay the price for this failure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Matthieu, you've heard Olivia and Johanna. How do you respond to this? Particularly when we talk about the energy transition. Are we really going to be able to change this? Are we going to be able to scale up? Yes, absolutely. If we want to, if we know how to see it through to the end. We're very lucky with the ecology and energy transition. It is doable. And I think we've got the tools necessary to see this through to the end, to see it to fruition. But it's up to us all, isn't it? This is not an epiphenomenon. This is a subject which is very gripping and very modern, shall I say? 5G, for example, is not going to solve the problem of energy fossils. That's a fact. But, we have to move forward and listen to everybody's side of the argument. We're used to sort of offsetting ideologies before we deal with the reality on the ground. We have to stop that. We've got a lot of democratic tools at our disposal. We need to use them to move forward, to strengthen the way we move forward, and to make our voices heard at the ballot box. There's a pacification of secular relations in our society. the citizen debate is witness to this. You have the municipal councils in Navarre shows that democracy has struggled, but has moved forward. And I cannot accept anything being impossible because we've lost 30 people en route. But I'm delighted to hear that the government is planning what's going to happen somewhere down the line. We cannot succeed in any kind of ecological transition if we don't use all of the tools in order to have a real adult conversation. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm afraid that we're running out of time. So let's take some questions. Questions from the floor. Olivia Grégoire? Olivia, just 1 minute. I'll just have one thing to add. We've all been, the way that we shout out in France can actually be our saviors, can savior in the democratic process. Says Johanna Rolland, you said a word that you used a word that I felt was very strong, and I liked it when I talked about the energy transition, etc. I witnessed the crisis with the yellow vests, for example. This crisis, this transition is an economic and social crisis, as we saw with the yellow vests. We have to address social inequality. I think it's important. And a last figure for you. We have to do this. We have to change the economic model, an ecological model. We're not against social equality. Of course, it goes hand in hand. Thank you very much for being present with us, Madam Minister. Now, let's take the first question. Civic initiative, yes. But isn't it not always the same citizens, the very well-off, very well-educated, who take these initiatives? Well, when it came to the Civic Convention, and that's the one I'm most familiar with, we spoke a great deal with many different people. People who were from fairly middle and lower middle class situations. And that person has become one of the most respected experts within the Convention Committee. Perhaps I could add something. I think that in this field, there's representation for everyone. There's room for everyone. At the end of the last mandate in Nantes, we had a great debate to see who was going to be included in this civic debate. And there, the person is saying that the most modest families are going to be the ones who are going to be furthest removed from the debates. Actually, the ones that are most removed from the debate are young parents with young children because they just don't have the time. And of course, the meetings start at 7 o'clock at night. That just doesn't work if you've got children. So we said, how can we do this? How can we organize it to include everyone? We talked about the economic transition and the ecological one. We worked with all associations in a community. We called it the community of all the wise givers, information givers. And we were all able to speak. Everybody had the minute. And we were able to, when you go and you do that on a Saturday morning, you don't have the same kind of inhabitant coming to the meeting. Next question. We have a world crisis. Could we not resolve this with global governance? Is the civic scale enough to address this crisis? Who would like to answer this one? Romain, would you like to say something? Between global and local, we have a space. You have the European space. And you can see there, it's already complicated enough if you want to try and instill transition. I'm thinking particularly about the citizen initiative in Europe, which is a petition. that has to be carried out in a minimum of 7 states, which will have to group together at least 1 million citizens. This is so that this has to be put in place. And theoretically, the European Parliament has to take hold of this citizen petition in order to put it in place. So certain actions have succeeded, and some people have actually managed to group together 1 million people in 7 different countries, particularly the one in order to reform the use of glyphosate. And this has been now considered by the Parliament. So at European level, it's already complicated. And we have a fight on our hands at this level. So if you want to go global, thank you, Romain. A global crisis like global warming, or there are physical limits here. But this is obviously going to have an impact at territorial and local level. And it's always going to be relevant to document this information for a particular area. We must document the diagnosis, understand the risk, and what might happen. That's the basis in order to implement any plan with the tools you have at hand, if you want to build a collective strategy which is resilient and robust. So, in times of crisis, and this is what armies do, you have to look at the strategic perspective. You have to start by building it locally, but to do that, you have to understand, for example, Aquitaine. Let's look at that region. And we have a climate expert there who was a pioneer, really, in this area. And he was trying to get people to get aware, people to be aware, particularly academics and farmers, and bringing them together to share his information, people that live in one region, so that they could understand the effects of global warming. And that understanding, that tool there is the basis. It's got to be the absolute pedestal upon which we build a strategy. A strategy that's going to be robust anyway, one that's going to go the distance. And if you talk about a global crisis, of course, there's going to be local consequences, and they're going to be different, and they're going to be very strong. There's no contradiction. I think they're quite complementary. Let's take another question. Would you like to add anything while we wait for a question, Johanna? Would you like to add something? Well, first of all, yes. I think we need 3 things. Decentralization, which allows us to have freedom for space and power at local governance level, saying that governance here, this is not governance which is restricted to one area. Mayors talk to each other. One big city will talk to another big city, especially when it comes to major challenges like the climate. And I think there is no more water tightness or air tightness between local and regional. We're all mixed. We need local governance, yes. We need various strategies. All strategies, whether it be local, national, or European, it has to be strong policies which are in place. If we don't, we won't have, then any kind of policy we want to improve is going to meet barriers. Global governance, it's not going to work. We have to look at local resilience. We can't wait for the American friends or our Russian or Chinese friends to put things in place for us to simply follow. No, we can't. We have to do it at home. Well, we have a question on that. Is a referendum the ultimate weapon in participatory democracy? I would say yes and no. It depends. And we had it before. It depends. We moderate the debate in order to reach an intelligent response to the referendum. We know that in France, we have to look at the person who's asked the question, what's the referendum about, etc. If we have a referendum and the president has committed to talking a certain amount of subjects which were born of the Civic Convention, then it could be interesting, because we've already had the primary debate of this convention. And this is going to gather momentum, encompass a greater part of the community, of society at large, and this could become interesting. This could be interesting to use the example of Nantes, or perhaps other local authorities. I'm thinking about Grenoble. I'm thinking about Barcelona, where there's a certain amount of engineering behind participation. This asks for what? It asks for a political will to do things properly, and tools be put in place to try and moderate this debate before the referendum, upstream. And only in that case, it could be a useful tool in order to discuss the major challenges in society. Thank you, Romain. How can we regain trust in our elected officials? Johanna, do you want to answer this question? Well, I think that this crisis has served to show us that we need time. And the worst thing you can do in a crisis is have stop-and-go answers. Everybody was able to, everybody saw what happened before the summer with schools, etc. When a situation arises, like the one we're going through, and we know that it's not going to improve over the next couple of weeks, that things are actually going to possibly get more difficult, then we have to have shared responsibility, shared liability. And I think many people in the political field have committed to this level of responsibility. To do that, you have to have consultation between the state and elected officials. And also, of course, the people of France have to accept the rules and the constraints, because there is a question of consistency. This seems absolutely paramount if we want things to happen as well as they possibly can. And you heard the Prime Minister last night saying he was going to accompany us, he was going to be by our sides. If there's no consultation, if there's no transparency, etc., and if we change our minds every 2 days, well, things will be unmanageable. Well, if you look at COVID, I'll give you a parallel. You've got climate change and COVID. Here we absolutely concur with everything you've just said, Johanna. You have to have consistency and coherence. It's vital. You cannot get it wrong. You can't be approximative. We talked about the yellow vests earlier, and I think this is fairly symptomatic. And when you become, this is situations which you demand a political response. If you look at the carbon tax, and the Homo economicus has got to make a rational choice to pay the tax, to buy a car which is going to cost him less, will cost him more, but actually will end up costing him less, environmentally speaking. What you're doing is taking one tool there and trying to hammer it home. I'm not sure you can do that. When you live in the suburbs and you're 40 miles from Le Havre and your train is never on time, you're going to use your car. You're going to take a diesel-fueled car. You've got no state. You've got no choice, really. And the state has to find alternatives, because if they don't, you as the Homo economicus, you're going to take what's best for you. Your therapeutic method is decided in some sense by the government's decisions then. So this therapeutic method has to be discussed and shared. And if it's not, it's disaster is pending. Right, here's a last question. Right, adult age for democracy. Does this not mean that we stop looking for a savior, but to look forward, to look at all the difficult and to address all the difficult questions that we face on a daily basis? Yes. Yes. Very nice definition, I would say. once again, we'll come back to what we said at the beginning of the debate. When you look at the complexity of the issues in front of us, it's extremely illusionary to think that there's a savior out there who's going to somehow cast a panacea. The problems are there, they're multiple, they're complex, and we all have to address them. But we all have to address them on two different levels. We have to be able to decide together, work with the elected officials, that's democracy, but we also have to act, put theory into practice. So when you look at the territorial level, in the largest sense of the word, that is where you can really decide and see the impact of your decisions, and where you can act most concretely and witness the progress of your initiatives. And I think it's extremely interesting that what I've seen in France in roughly 20 places where they have startups, and their objective is to create companies which are useful for the citizens, for people living in that particular region. And that's where you have the short circuits. That's where you have new ways of consuming, of living. And I think part of the solution, perhaps, is in that project. Yes, you talked about democracy that I hear in your proposals. Is this about associating citizens with baseline proposals, or is it actually being involved in action? Well, actually, I would say it's the two. When we had the debate on the energy transition here in Nantes, we went to the communities and we put different people in place. And we had one community called the défricheurs, the people who clear, well, technically that would be somebody clearing land. And we gave them all challenges. People saying, you know, I'm going to go to work without my car, and we're going to we're going to carpool, etc. We had people saying what they were going to do to contribute to the citizen movement. When you talk about this kind of democracy, you had young people. We had young people between the age of 18 to 30 in that age group who before didn't participate in the debate. And this corresponds with what we've heard from people in the street when they said we no longer have time. Or they would say it's no longer time to reflect, it's time to act. This is something that we took on board. We understood what they were saying. And you have to, if you want to conjugate, if you want to link your policies with action. And this sometimes entails giving space to people who wouldn't normally have access to this space. We have 1 minute left, so the last question. Can we have participatory democracy for all types of decisions, particularly in times of crisis, like lockdown, for example? What would you like to say to this? I think we can, yes. I think we can do it on all subjects, even, most especially perhaps in the difficult ones. In an adult society, safety has to be part of our concern. We have to talk about subjects which are not very much fun with our citizens, but I think you also have to take responsibility for the decisions. At the end of this participatory meeting, you have to make a decision. Because it's great to chat and to talk and to discuss, but you must have a decision at the end of this. And the most serious the situation might be, then the more the question of responsibility with regards to decision is important, and all the consequences which actually go hand in hand with this responsibility. And this will lead to other debates. Authority in our country. Can we accept authority? And I think that leads to many different discussions ahead. Yes, we all have a very complete diary. So thank you to all four of you having come here today, have participated. Thank you to you who asked questions, and have a great evening.